Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with MysticGenMara.com, a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho. And tonight we're going back to our series of Occult and Crochet, and I have to say, to be perfectly honest with you, the last couple of weeks, due to day job and other commitments, I've not been able to get as much crocheting done as I would like. I've only added like 3 rows on the shawl that I've been working on. So there's not much there extra other than, let's see if I can do this without tipping it on the floor. I have started on the next round of little, they're supposed to be butterflies, they look more like dragonflies to me. But we're starting on the next round of those, which I think, judging by the amount of yarn, I'll have this set and one more before this one's done. So, that's about as far as I've gotten on that, unfortunately. But we are going to go back into our witch trials. This particular one is one of the, I guess what you would call known witch hunters, like more well known than some of the other ones, but there's not a lot there. And I will say this right now before we get into him, I dug around a lot, and the stories, every website I went to, any reference that I could dig up from different sources, all had, within a few word changes, the same baseline story, and that's what we're going to go over here. And I kind of found that annoying, because it's like, this guy sounds a lot more interesting than the basics that they're going to offer us, but that's what we've got, so that's what we'll go with. Tonight's witch hunter is Georg Scherer, or Scherer. He was born in 1540, give or take a year or two, because, you know, dates back in that time, they were good at keeping records of certain things, but it wasn't exact science. He came into this world in the area of Austria, which would be a similar state in Austria called Tyrol, or Tyrol, and the town was Schwaz. I had to look this up because I was like, the town sounds interesting, and I love Austria. Like, this is a pretty little town, and I can just only imagine what it looked like back in the day. Like, it's one. I'm not a winter person, but this looks absolutely beautiful. Like, I would love to visit that area just because of that. It looks amazing. But where are we at? Not much is said about his childhood, which is kind of a typical thing with these guys. Especially the witch hunters. It's like they tried to keep them as much quiet as they could, at least what's available. But what we do know is when he was around 19 in 1559, he joined the group called the Society of Jesus. That name may not ring a bell to you, but the next one will. This particular group went by the name the Jesuits. These guys keep popping up whenever people are being set to unalive. So one day we'll get into that. I personally need to do more digging into that one. Not quite there yet. But when he would join this particular group, this would start his more than 40-year work for the church in Austria. And we're not gonna dive too far into that just yet. Sorry. I had a really late night. Those of you who've worked retail as a day job and have ever had to deal with inventory situations, it was this last couple days have been pretty long. Anyway, so what I'm going to do here is we're going to go through the basics of his history. We're going to lay the foundation for it. Then we'll move into the hunting part, because I want to give you an idea of kind of where this guy stood and what he stood for. Because, like I said, there's not a lot there, but I want to lay a good groundwork for why things went the way they did. Sorry. Tonight's kombucha is their seasonal GT Synergy. It's their gratitude one, and it has flavors of apple, turmeric, carrot, and spices. It's actually really good. It sounds different, but it's kind of like a spiced apple cider, but there's a little bit more of a kick to it. Anyway, George was a well-known orator, and today we call that a public speaker. The other term that they mentioned a few times was conversationalist, but in this particular aspect, it was conversation from the pulpit, or maybe even a teacher aspect. But from what I could find, this all started from a very young age. Like, he was, before he joined the Jesuits, and he did that when he was 19, so they're saying years beforehand. So he may have just been raised in a situation where he had this natural charisma to be a speaker. Not many people have that particular talent, but he did. And I can only imagine, if he was alive today, how much he would love live streaming. But he also was a prolific writer, and I'll just make note of this real quick. He was a prolific writer, and he wrote a lot in his lifetime. It was republished around 1690-ish, but nothing that I could find, at least in an English translation, exists today. There were several German ones I could find. I could find some in French, which was weird, but I couldn't find anything that was translated into English. So if there's something out there, please let me know, because I am kind of curious about what else this guy got into. In the year 1577, he stepped into the role of court preacher for the Archduke Matthias. And I just have to say this, and if you've looked in the description of the video, you already know. Have any of you guys seen an anime from like 15, 20 years ago called Lady Death, based on an old graphic novel or manga type comic? There's an Archduke in there who is called Matthias, and it takes place in Austria. It made me giggle when I was researching it, because that was the first name that popped up. But I have no idea if the writers of that actually based it off of the same person or not. But the guy in the movie's not exactly a good guy. And so it kind of made me laugh. But this particular Matthias is not a fully bad person. I think he was trying to do the right thing. I just think it played out the wrong way. Anyway, a few years later, in 1590, George would be appointed to the role of rector of the local Jesuit college. Really liked his oration, his speaking, his sermons, from what I could find, were pretty impressive. He was seen as very stern and harsh, which would tie into that time period when speaking from the pulpit was hellfire and brimstone. And this would actually lead, because of his a little more hostile personality, would lead him being transferred from Vienna to Linz in 1594. And George would hold the position of court preacher until around the year 1600, so this was over 20 years. He was basically a state-appointed preacher for the Archduke. And during that time period, he also held the position of rector of the Jesuit College in Vienna. So over his time, he held some really big positions. And what's funny is he was able to juggle both of them. I mean, he had help, obviously, but that's still pretty impressive. So as I was digging around, I ran across this one story, and it was referenced in a couple of spots. The one that I'm referencing right now is actually from, as dumb as it sounds, Wikipedia, because it was a source that popped this up. And then the more I dug into it, it actually shows up in a Catholic encyclopedia of people, and there was another location. It was like just a general encyclopedia mentions this. The Catholic one denounces this next part completely, but it is kind of funny. He was speaking one day, George was, and he made the claim, and I laughed a lot when I read this, if the Catholic Church is not the true church, may I be struck blind. Ask and you shall receive. And the story goes, after which he was struck blind for a period of 3 days. The Catholic, this George person, but they were, and they claimed, because he was a high-ranking Jesuit and all the rest of this, that this would actually upend their power, so this could not be a true story. I did find it amusing. The fact that it stuck so heavily in the collective at the time makes me curious if there wasn't something that went on there that might have indicated that that could have happened. Anyway, and I'm not, didn't forget, we're getting into George's witch hunting shortly. This part is kind of important because it gives you a background of who we're dealing with here. George would be what we would call today an anti-reformationist or a counter-reformationist. He literally hated everything to do with the Reformation movement. It didn't matter what it was, he hated it all. He would refute big names within the Lutheran Church. He opposed all unions with the other variations of the church, the Greek Orthodox, the Byzantium, all of these other groups. He had zero patience or tolerance for them. And over his time in Austria, he actually was able to actually build up enough anger to push him back. So he did, I guess, one good thing there. And he would not be fighting. I mean, he's going to fight from the pulpit. He's not getting out there with a sword. And he did rouse the masses to action, which is impressive because, he was a great orator. That's what he was going to do. Oh, quilt making, that is I tried that. I'm not really good at it, though. But yeah, that's definitely a fun one. I have friends that quilt, sorry, but getting distracted by chat. But which I like. I like having people chat with me. So where am I at? Just completely lost it. There. Back to George. The foundation, that's our basis. That's our foundation. So he's a very good orator. He was a counter-reformationist, didn't like any of those people. Basically didn't like anyone who didn't believe like he did. So that's where we're at. He was a very stern Jesuit priest as well, who was quite well known for speaking against other religions and beliefs, and it is said that he had a very harsh countenance, so he scowled a lot, is how I interpreted that. What I also thought was kind of interesting is the more I dug around, there are no images for this man. Like, none. I went through the Catholic encyclopedias, I went through various encyclopedias. There's other people from this time period that had some form of imagery. Him, nothing. Not that I could find. Now we're into our witch hunting period, and the above, or the preceding timeline is stretched over about 40 years. We're kind of jumping into the end of that time period. George had a firm belief, considering the source here, in the Death to Witches clan. He had no major issues with the state doing what they needed to do to these people, but he would admit or advocate for the church being involved in every step of this process. He believed that witches were possessed by the devil. Of course he would. Therefore, since the church dealt in spiritual and demons, the church, i.e. the Jesuits, should be involved in the court trials. Not really sure if this is a good idea or not, just in general. This situation, you just let us do the interview and you can get your hands dirty. We won't mess with that. The big part was the church wanted to make sure they interviews of the witches. When I say interviews, it can insert the word torture. It's pretty much what they did. And this was where it actually led him into a minor conflict with some of the Jesuits in his area, which kind of stood out to me. Claudio Acquaviva disapproved of the harsh tactics of George, and that didn't even slow George down. George was known to be highly aggressive in his interviewing of suspects. He would get his answers one way or another, because in his mind he viewed anyone who was deemed a witch was so possessed that their deceitfulness had to be beaten out of them. So he didn't care how much he had to put somebody through. He was going to get his confession one way or another. Obviously, even though Claudio was significantly higher in the food chain in the Jesuit clan, and he could disapprove all he want. The dynamic was a little bit weird because George was allowed to do what he did. And there's one primary case that I'm going to talk about because it actually turns out to, yeah, and there are, when I talk, I did a video before in Germany, and that's actually one of the theories, modern day theories, that a lot of the hallucinations were actually caused from the grain that, what did you put, yeah, the ergot mold, and that is actually a very strong theory as to what happened with some of the German witch hunts, and I think the French as well. This particular one actually doesn't have that type of an aspect to it. Personally, I think this was just a little bit of vendetta that was being spread here. So, and this is, like I said, this is one of the only deaths attributed to this area, and this would actually start in 1583. This case is said to be the only case of a witch burning in Vienna's history, and in the area of Tyrone or Tyrol, it's one of the only executions of someone who was accused of witchcraft in its history. So he was literally the driving force to this person's demise. And let's introduce our supposed witch. Her name is Elise Planisher. This elderly lady, and I mean that literally, she was 70 at the time that this occurred. She was from a town in Lower Austria called Menk. I could not find good pictures of this. Everything was like of some soccer here in America, football in Europe, stars, and a couple of like industrial buildings. I was trying to find like the actual city, could not find good pictures of it, so sorry. First strike against Elise in George's eyes. She was a born Lutheran. You know how even for a Lutheran, she would take care of her great-granddaughter, Anna. The mother had passed away when the girl was very little, and Elise had been the only real mother that Anna had known. And at the age of 17, Anna's very Catholic father, Elise's son-in-law, would take Anna away from Elise. Spontaneous thing after the move, or if this had been going on for a while prior. I'm assuming that it had been going on most of her life. Dad just didn't know. And that is, Anna suffered seizures. And once she was in St. Polten, she would have seizures and spasms frequently. Today, there's a strong theory that what she was dealing with was epilepsy, like some kind of mental disorder that they didn't even understand back in the day. And her good Catholic father believed that Grandma Elise had placed a hex on his daughter. I don't even have words for some of these people. Like, that's what you thought was my daughter. Okay. Smart father, of course, he would go to Vienna and bring the charge of witchcraft against his elderly mother-in-law, the woman from a very young child. That's the part about this that, again, I get really hostile about this kind of nonsense, because a little bit of logic and common sense that we have today, medical science is different, I get that, but seriously, because of this charge, Elise would be brought to Vienna from Menk to stand trial. And now that she's in Vienna, here comes our anti-hero George, our Jesuit confessor friend. He would investigate this charge himself and solve this problem. He liked to use various interrogation techniques mixed with exorcism rites to find out the truth from Anna. Now, mind you, this poor kid was having seizures, and George was like, I'm going to interrogate you. And this poor kid was already dealing with enough, and now you've got this stern, grumpy old Jesuit priest coming in to harangue you until you gave him the answers. This man would run her through the emotional and spiritual ringer for over 2 days. I can't even imagine what this quote-unquote investigation would actually be. But it didn't take place in a courthouse. No, can't have that. It took place in the Church of St. Barbara in, oh, this is a German word, give me a second. Fleischmarkt? Not really good with that language. You know, keeping that church-state thing separate, George was really sticking to that like no one ever does. George was victorious in his mind because he claimed to have found and removed over 12,000 demons from poor Anna, who was having seizures. After all of the mental and spiritual torture, didn't specify if there was physical, but we can already guess, Anna would eventually denounce her grandmother Elise as a witch. I'm sorry, but I'm pretty sure that this kid would have agreed to anything to get this nonsense to stop. And that's pretty much how these people work. St. Barbara. Oh, yeah, St. George is another fun one I want to actually go over. That's some interesting history and lore there. And I want to make something clear as we go forward here. I 100% believe that possession occurs. Not denouncing that. I firmly believe that that's a real thing. Exorcism rites, whether they're Catholic or otherwise, do not think what these people were dealing with had anything to do with actual possession or witchcraft. Just knowing what I know about these type of things, I don't fully believe, especially in this instance, this has anything to do with demons or witches. The sick part about the witch hunting craze that was going on from the 14th century until the late 1700s, they were hungry for death and power. And they, as in any of the people in authority who, especially if they could tie themselves to the church or get better standings, which was a sick way to get authority in that time, but that happened. They would use whatever tactics they could to take out their opponents, whether it was for land, whether it was for spouses, that happened, whether it was for just the church growing in power and authority, building more fear into the people. It happened like that a lot, and that's the sick part about this whole situation. When you tie blind religious zealotry into a craving for death and power, it's a recipe for disaster across the board. History needs to be seen so the patterns won't repeat. That's kind of the purpose of the occult and crochet aspect of this, is I personally like to understand the history, but I also want to make sure that other people have access, or at least some concept of what can happen when we don't use common sense and reason, because this has nothing to do with common sense. And basically torture from Anna, Elise would be arrested and taken to the rogue's house. What I was digging around, I was like, rogue's house, that just sounds vaguely familiar. It was a very notorious prison where torture was the norm to gain confessions. This was a house of murderers. This was a house of thieves. This was a house of Austin. She was pitched straight into the pit with the rest of these psychos. And Elise was placed in the loving hands, when she was tossed into there, of the rogue house's inquisitors. You can literally stick the word torturer in there and get the same thing. Yeah, it's interesting when you start digging into this more, because the history that we were taught when we were young, and I don't care what religious group you were raised with, the history is a lot darker than what you people realize. And this time period had very little to do with actual spirituality and growth. It was about power. And that's, like I said, that's the sick part about this. And after a short period of time, and I couldn't find a time period, and I looked, this entire thing happened in 1583, so it could have been in January, February that Elise was taken in, and the confession would actually eventually come from her that she was a witch and she'd placed this hex. But the confession was weak, obviously. The confession was actually so weak that the mayor of Vienna petitioned the emperor of the area to overturn the confession and release Elise, because he knew that this was wrong, and he knew 100% this was fake. He knew that you cannot accept a confession from torture. But here's what actually did happen. George, being the great orator that he was, would not allow the state to just throw out this case. And he was there, from what I could find, at least on part of the occasion, for the interrogation of Elise. And I'm sure he was enjoying that show. And he got, who knows, some new ideas to take with him for later. But George vehemently argued with the emperor against Elise's release. He would use the church and threats of hellfire to add pressure to his arguments. He literally was using his position as a Jesuit priest to threaten the emperor, because that was the power that the church held in that time. The emperor, due to that kind of pressure, would deny the mayor's petition, and actually did, as he could be very passionate. I can't even imagine what kind of a speech of hellfire and brimstone this man would have given. I'm sure it would be impressive to watch. Just for this particular reason, it was sick as far as I'm concerned. This poor old woman named Elise. She was a mother, she was a grandmother, a Lutheran, and in my personal opinion, not a witch in the slightest, would actually be burned at the stake in September of 1583. So who knows how long she'd actually sat in torture, going through this nonsense, being put under, I won't go into all that because there is, they did keep records of what kind of devices they used. And after she was burned, her ashes would be scattered on the Danube River so as to complete the purification for her soul. These people were insane. I have no other words for it. This human, barely, Georg Scherer, would thankfully pass from this world in 1605 while he was living in the town of Linz. It is said that he died of apoplexy. I wanted to double check that meaning before I said anything, and what we would call today is hemorrhaging. Some believe that he had a hemorrhagic stroke, so the blood vessels in his brain just exploded. Sounds painful, probably not painful enough for someone as evil as him. Yeah, the 1700s in France were impressive. What I did find interesting through all of this, though, was in a time where record keeping was actually really good. The church kept really good records. And even the court systems kept really good records through this whole time. And I was impressed by a lot of the records I found for other ones. But there's this weird little blank spot when it comes to witch hunting. They're lost. Oops, we don't have records. No records. Sorry. I literally was digging through pages and pages. I have encyclopedia sets myself that I was going through. Everything that I could find had an almost identical section on George. And this happened with a couple of the other names that are known but not fully detailed out. I purposely feel like some of this stuff may just have been lost to history, which does happen on occasion. But when you have a court system and a church system that kept really detailed and thorough records, and all of a sudden they just disappear one day, I feel like there might have been some things just removed from history because they don't want to have their history known, because they want to paint a picture of, we are the right people, we are the good ones, we're the good guys. But are you in everything? Like, I'm not denying that they do good work, but the history needs to be known so that we don't repeat similar mistakes later. And I almost feel like there was something that may be hidden somewhere in there, the more you dig, conspiracy theorist here, that might actually destroy some of the foundations of some of these beliefs and systems, just because you don't do this type of thing to innocent people without some purpose behind it. And it can't just be the purpose of, well, I think they might be into some demonic, evil, dark stuff. Like, no, that's just not enough for me. This was one that I dug around a lot. I really wanted to get more information about the situation, and this is all I could find. Elise was, unfortunately, the only victim, well, fortunately in this respect, of George in Vienna. Whether he got other people elsewhere, there's no record of it that I could find. There's not a lot of information about him, except this. And I really wanted to get a hold of some of the English translations of his work, just because the way they reference and talk about his oration skills, just a little curious as to what that might have sounded like. Like, to be a powerful, harsh, and stern person like that, is it like beating the pulpit and, calling down hellfire type thing? Just more of, I like listening to those kind of people. They're fun. But let me double check my notes here. That's kind of the end of George when he would pass away in 1605. So that's one of the few in Germany that I could find. So we'll see what else we can dig up for the next one. We're getting close to the end of the really well-known European witch hunters. We will talk about what happened in Salem at a different time. I know I was trying to time this out so it would land on Halloween. It's not going to work for me. So we're going to keep pushing through the rest of the witch hunters into November. It would be interesting to see how modern tech would interrogate some of these people. I will agree with that, because it's interesting when you start looking through some of the histories, what we don't know and what could be there, which would be fascinating. But next Monday, it's the 4th Monday. Yeah. So we'll be doing our myth and tarot, talking about some mythological creatures. And then the following Monday, we'll be back. And with any luck, we'll actually hit one of the biggest witch hunters. And that one might actually be a two-parter, because the one that I really want to go over, and this kind of inspired this, there's been movies made about this man. The history records are full of his nonsense. And it'll be interesting to fully flesh that particular character out. And then, like I said, we'll go into some of the Salem witch trials, because they aren't the only ones. They're the most well-known, the biggest kerfluffle that happened in the States. But there are a couple of other minor ones, and we'll just kind of glance through some of those. But I think we're done for tonight. So if you enjoyed this type of conversation, thank you for popping in. I love getting some feedback, so that makes makes it more fun that I'm just not talking to a screen. But I do appreciate that. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and comment if you're watching this on replay, and let me know any thoughts, feelings, opinions, or any other characters that you would like me to talk about and go over. Kind of right now we're going through a bunch of witch hunting, so if you have witch trial people or maybe even victims of witch trials, I will totally look those up, because that's what we're doing here. We're trying to expand the knowledge and share what we can share. So have a great rest of your night, guys and gals, and I will see you in the next episode.